Every Muslim political movement of the last 100 years has chased the same dream: an Islamic state. A state governed by Shari'a. A state that embodies Muslim values. A state that finally ends the humiliation of colonialism and restores the dignity of the Ummah. Wael Hallaq, one of the most respected scholars of Islamic law alive today, says that dream is built on a contradiction. Not because Islam is incompatible with governance, but because the modern state, as a structure, as an institution, as a technology of power, is fundamentally incompatible with what Islam actually is. This is a review of the impossible state, and it will challenge assumptions that most Muslims have never thought to question. Wael Hallaq is the Avalon Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. He is one of the world's foremost scholars of Islamic law, Islamic legal theory, and the history of Shari'a. This is not a book written by an Orientalist trying to undermine Islam. It is written by a Muslim scholar who has spent his entire career immersed in the depth and richness of the Islamic legal tradition, and who is alarmed by what he sees Muslims doing to it in the name of reviving it. Published in 2013 by Columbia University Press, The Impossible State is his most ambitious and controversial work. It has been praised as a tour de force and attacked as deeply flawed, sometimes by the same scholar. That tension is exactly what makes it essential reading. The book has 7 chapters. Hallaq builds his argument in 3 stages. First, he defines what the modern state actually is and traces its European origins. Second, he describes what premodern Islamic governance actually was and how fundamentally different it was from the modern state. Third, he shows why trying to pour Islamic governance into the container of the modern state is not just practically difficult, but structurally impossible. Let's go through it. Hallaq begins by asking a question most people never think to ask. What exactly is the modern state? Not what it claims to be, but what it structurally is. He identifies 4 defining features of the modern state. First, sovereignty. The modern state claims absolute, unchallengeable authority over a defined territory and population. No authority above the state is recognized. Not God, not tradition, not natural law. The state is sovereign. Period. Second, monopoly of violence. The state alone has the legitimate right to use force. All other uses of force within its territory are illegal. Third, penetration of the subject. The modern state reaches into every aspect of its citizens' lives. Education, taxation, identity, law, even language, to shape them into a particular kind of person, the national citizen. Fourth, separation of politics from morality. The modern state operates on the basis of power, law, and procedure, not on the basis of virtue or divine command. The state is morally neutral by design. Hallaq's point. These four features are not universal features of governance. The book has 7 chapters. Hallaq builds his argument in 3 stages. First, he defines what the modern state actually is, and traces its European origins. Second, he describes what premodern Islamic governance actually was, and how fundamentally different it was from the modern state. Third, he shows why trying to pour Islamic governance into the container of the modern state is not just practically difficult, but structurally impossible. Let's go through it. They are specifically European, historically specific, culturally particular. They emerged from a very specific European history of religious wars, feudalism, and the separation of church and state. The modern state was then exported to the rest of the world through colonialism, not as one option among many, but as the only legitimate form of political organization. In his second chapter, Hallaq traces the modern state's DNA. The modern state emerged from a very specific sequence of European crises: the breakdown of the Catholic Church's authority, the Reformation and the wars of religion, the rise of secular philosophy through Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, and eventually the French and American revolutions. The key moment was this: when Europe decided that religion could no longer be trusted to govern public life. It needed a replacement. The state became that replacement: sovereign, secular, morally neutral. Hallaq's argument. This history is European. It does not belong to Islam. Islam never had a church and state to separate. Islam never had religious wars of the European type. Islam never developed the concept of sovereignty as absolute human authority. Because in Islam, sovereignty belongs to Allah alone. When colonialism imposed the modern state on Muslim societies, it was not offering them a neutral tool. It was offering them a European solution to a European problem that Muslims had never had. Hallaq's third chapter compares the constitutional structures of premodern Islamic governance and modern Western states, and his conclusion is startling. In the modern state, the separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judiciary is constantly compromised. The executive tends to dominate. Law becomes an instrument of state power, rather than a constraint upon it. In pre-modern Islamic governance, the jurists, the ulama, operated independently of the political ruler. The ruler could not change the Shari'a. He could not make law. He governed within a framework of divine law. that existed above and beyond his authority. Hallaq's comparison. The pre-modern Islamic system had a more genuine separation of powers than most modern states do, because in Islam, the highest authority was not a parliament or a president. It was the Shari'a itself, and no human being could override it. This chapter is the intellectual core of the book. Hallaq argues that Islamic governance and the modern state are not just different systems. They represent two fundamentally incompatible worldviews, two completely different understandings of what law is, what politics is, and what a human being is. In the modern state, law is whatever the state legislates. It is positive law, created by human beings, changeable by human beings, reflecting the will of the majority or the power of the elite. In Islamic governance, law is not created. It is discovered. The Shari'a is not a human legislative product. It is the expression of divine will, which the jurists interpret and apply, but do not create. The modern state asks, what has the legislature decided? Islamic governance asks, what does Allah require? These are not two versions of the same question. They are two entirely different civilizational frameworks. And trying to answer the second question, using the institutional machinery designed for the first, is the fundamental contradiction. At the heart of every Islamic state project in the modern world, this is Hallaq's most profound chapter, and the one most directly relevant to every Muslim alive today. He argues that Islamic governance and the modern state do not just organize society differently. They produce different kinds of human beings. The modern state produces the national citizen, an individual defined by rights, by nationality, by economic productivity, and by loyalty to the state. This person's primary identity is political and national. Islamic governance produced the Muslim subject, a person defined by their relationship to Allah, to the community of believers, to the moral framework of the Shari'a. This person's primary identity was spiritual and moral, not national. Hallaq's most disturbing observation. The modern state does not just govern Muslim bodies. It reshapes Muslim souls through its education system, its legal system, its media, its economic structures. It produces people who think, feel, and desire in ways fundamentally shaped by secular modernity, whether they identify as Muslim or not. The Islamic State project, he argues, is being attempted by people who have already been shaped by the very system they are trying to replace. Hallaq applies his framework to 3 case studies: the Iranian Revolution, Pakistan's constitutional battles over Shari'a, and Egypt's Islamist movements. In each case, the pattern is the same. Islamist movements capture the modern state through revolution, election, or military force. They then attempt to Islamize it, to impose Islamic law through the state's legislative and bureaucratic machinery. And here is the contradiction Hallaq identifies. The moment you legislate the Shari'a through a parliament, you have made it positive law, a human creation, subject to amendment, repeal, and judicial review by secular courts. You have placed divine law under human sovereignty. This is not the restoration of Islamic governance. It is the absorption of Islamic law into the framework of the modern state. The very framework that was designed to make divine law irrelevant. Hallaq does not end with despair. But his answer is not a political program. He argues that Muslims need to stop asking, "How do we build an Islamic state?" and start asking, "How do we recover the moral and spiritual formation that Islamic governance was built upon?" The pre-modern Islamic system worked not because of its political structures, but because of the moral subjects it produced. People who internalized the Shari'a, not because the state enforced it, but because their hearts had been formed by it. Hallaq invites Muslims and the West to look seriously at Islamic history, not as a source of political blueprints, but as a reservoir of moral and civilizational resources that the modern world desperately needs. This book is unusual for this channel, because Hallaq himself is writing from within the Islamic tradition. This is not a secular thinker who accidentally arrived at Islamic conclusions. This is a Muslim scholar delivering a warning to his own community. So the Islamic lens here is not about connecting an outsider to Islamic thought. It is about taking Hallaq's warning seriously and asking what it means for us. Hallaq's deepest point is this: the crisis of the Muslim world is not primarily political. It is moral and spiritual. Muslims have been shaped by modernity into a kind of person for whom the pre-modern Islamic system would be as alien as it would be to a secular European. This connects directly to what Imam Ghazali diagnosed in the 11th century. Ghazali did not reform Islam through politics. He reformed it through tarbiyyah, the formation of the self. The Ihya Ulum al-Din is not a political manifesto. It is a manual for rebuilding the Muslim soul from the inside out. Hallaq is saying the same thing in 2013 that Ghazali was saying in 1095. Before you can have an Islamic state, you need Islamic people, and Islamic people are not produced by constitutions and parliaments. They are produced by tarbiyyah, by salah, by the community of the masjid, by the transmission of knowledge from scholar to student, generation by generation. The Quran does not say, "Establish a state and the people will follow." It says, "Change what is in yourselves." and Allah will change your condition. Hallaq's book is a reminder that Muslims have been trying to skip that step for 100 years, and the results speak for themselves. Hallaq's book is difficult, dense, at times frustrating. He does not give you easy answers, and some of his critics argue, with some justification, that he romanticizes premodern Islamic governance and underestimates the real problems Muslims faced within it. But his central insight is one that every serious Muslim in the 21st century needs to wrestle with. The modern state is not a neutral container into which you can pour Islamic content. It is a specific civilizational product with specific assumptions about sovereignty, law, and the human being. Assumptions that are incompatible with Islamic foundations. Before Muslims can build anything, they need to understand what they are building on and what they are building with. If this kind of thinking is what you came here for, subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you think an Islamic state is possible in the modern world? Or is Hallaq right? This is the Enlightened study.